Привіт! So we now have a copy of the draft agreement for rare earths, as Donald Trump has been referring to it as between Ukraine and the US. So I'm going to cast my discerning eye over the text. I am a former lawyer. I worked at the EU institutions at one point and also in the private sector. So with that legal background, I'll give you a little bit more of an insightful reaction than the average YouTube commentator who is talking about the happenings of the Russo-Ukrainian war. If you're new to this channel, my name is Connor Klein. I've been living in Ukraine for many years, speak both Ukrainian and Russian, have a background in international relations as well as law. So I'm here to give you a more nuanced reaction to the happenings in the Russo-Ukrainian war. So let's get into it. We have seen the draft. I'll put a link to it down below if you want to go and read it. It's not very long, in fact. And the first spoiler, I guess, it's not a rare earths agreement. There's actually no explicit reference to rare earths in the entire document. What it is, to quote the title, it is a bilateral agreement establishing terms and conditions for a reconstruction investment fund. So basically, you could say that it's like a framework agreement for a later agreement that will be negotiated between the US and Ukraine for the reconstruction of Ukraine. So it is not explicitly about rare earths metals, as Donald Trump has used that expression a lot. It also does not have any figures explicitly mentioned. So Donald Trump has mentioned $500 billion that he claims the US has given to Ukraine, although that has more or less been debunked to this point. He also says $300 billion and $350 billion at times, but it's probably somewhere around 100 billion, and then even you could argue about the real value of the arms that were sent to Ukraine, since the actual money that was allocated was primarily spent on building replacement weapons in the US to replenish US stockpiles. But regardless, there is no explicit mention of figures. There is a 50-50 split between the Ukrainians and the Americans with respect to this later investment fund that still has to be negotiated. That's why this is a framework agreement. And the money that will be put into this investment fund for the reconstruction of the Ukraine will come from new extractions of Ukraine's mineral wealth, to sum it up. So that is basically what the agreement is about. Is this good for America? Is this good for Ukraine? Well, it's pretty vague. So it is hard to tell at this point. There's nothing that stands out as being particularly nefarious in the document from either side's point of view, because again, it is basically like it's pretty similar to a memorandum of understanding. It's not called that. It's a bilateral agreement establishing the terms and conditions for a reconstruction investment fund. But because it's so vague and it's just establishing the framework, it's hard to say whether this would be good or bad. So the next question is, why has Donald Trump framed this as a rare earths minerals deal, and that Zelensky must sign the deal on rare earths? It seems a bit of a misnomer. There are some rare earths in Ukraine. There's a lot of speculation about how much they're really worth. And my reaction to that would be, well, if they were super valuable and easy to get, surely the Soviets would have already extracted them, or some Ukrainian oligarchs since independence in the early 90s. So they're probably pretty hard to get at and maybe not really that valuable, but we don't know exactly. And it is a percentage that is stated in this document, not an actual overall figure. So it's hard to know whether this would be good or bad from a monetary point of view at this point. It would also require, presumably, a situation where Ukraine is not in active fighting in order for those resources to be extracted. Again, they are new resources. They're not the ones that have been currently extracted. So from the average Ukrainian's point of view, well, it will be in a situation where presumably there is some peace, and also it would be new revenue streams. So if that money is then investment into reconstruction of Ukraine, then that would seem to be pretty good from that point of view. So that's the first thing. The second thing is it does tie the US to some sort of peaceful resolution in Ukraine where they can go and extract resources, and presumably they would send Americans there and be concerned about their safety. So this creates some sort of implicit security, I wouldn't say guarantee, but assurance, and we'll get into the legalese of why those two words and distinction between them are actually relevant. So it's laying the groundwork that could be quite attractive for Ukraine in the future. And the actual investment fund agreement will have to be negotiated, and there's not a timeline for that as yet. And also, if we look at it realistically, will Donald Trump stay in power to actually see these minerals extracted? It depends. It will presumably take many years to do all the geological surveys, send over the equipment and the people to extract it, and then extract the minerals out of the ground. It may take 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. I'm not really sure, but it's definitely a long-term project, and there may be even a different government in Kyiv and in Washington at that point that may negotiate really good terms for the US or really good terms for Ukraine, or just mutually great terms. So it's hard at this point to say what will be the end result, but there is nothing particularly problematic from Ukraine's point of view in it so far. But there is the potential for a lot of dodgy shenanigans to go on, because basically the US would and Ukraine would have joint control over how the money is spent. The money that goes into the fund will come from Ukraine's new resources that have been extracted, and then it needs to be divvied out to fund reconstruction, which of course was rebuilding Ukraine, presumably when there is at least a pause in the fighting, if not an overall peace settlement. Although I am, if you see my other videos, very skeptical about the opportunities for a long-term peace at the moment, because basically the underlying problems to this war has not been resolved and don't look like being resolved pretty soon. In short, Russia doesn't believe that Ukraine has the right to be independent of Moscow, and Ukraine really doesn't want to be in Moscow's sphere of influence. They want to join the European Union and be in, and also NATO for the Article 5 security guarantee. So they want to be in the sphere of influence of Washington and Brussels. And that is the underlying issue that has caused this war, because Russia just does not accept that. To quote Karl von Clausewitz, war is the continuation of politics by other means. So some things that stood out, having cast my legal eye over the document, there is actually a reference to the Budapest Memorandum. It's not explicit. It's there in the preamble. I think it's actually the last point of the preamble. Again, you can go and read the document. It's not that long, so you can probably read it in a few minutes. And it says, whereas the United States and Ukraine recognize the contribution that Ukraine has made to strengthening international peace and security by voluntarily abandoning the world's third largest arsenal of nuclear weapons. So there are no security guarantees explicitly in this document, this draft. And apparently, from what we hear in the media and online and statements between Ukrainian and American officials, possibly this agreement will be signed in Washington tomorrow. Zelensky may fly to the US, but really he is looking to negotiate a change to the document to insert some explicit security guarantees. The security guarantee is different to a security assurance. The language of the Budapest Memorandum, which was in 1994, and basically Ukraine gave up its nuclear arsenal and actually some of its long-range bombers, if I remember correctly, and actually gave those to Russia, remarkably. They got security assurances. And basically, when Russia violated the Budapest Memorandum in 2014, they annexed Crimea illegally, and they invaded the Donbass and de facto controlled some of the territory there, along with some local collaborators called separatists. And basically, the US did nothing, saying that, yeah, you had a security assurance, it is not a guarantee. So basically, it was not worth the paper it was written on. And Ukraine obviously is very concerned about any sort of agreements that would end up being security assurances in the future and not security guarantees. Security guarantee would mean that the country would be obligated to intervene and protect Ukraine's sovereignty. So far, the US has provided financial and military support and maybe intelligence support, but they have not intervened. And whilst they still support Ukrainian sovereignty. Even under the Trump administration, we haven't got to that point yet, at least. They are looking to have that included. So that might be one change that will come. Donald Trump seems to be pushing the Europeans to provide security guarantees, but presume that they wouldn't be signatories to this document. It is between the United States and Ukraine. The other big thing is there is an opportunity for a lot of cronyism with respect to this document, because even if we have to see the details that are going to be negotiated in the real deal, which will be when they actually have an investment plan agreement, which it's stated here will be negotiated going forward. The US originally wanted 100% control of how the monies were dispersed, and that would give them the power to decide who is going to do the reconstruction, and presumably those would be US companies, maybe exclusively companies that will be friendly with the US government that is in charge. Obviously at the moment that's Donald Trump and the Republicans. And yeah, if you have political connections, if you're a big donor, then presumably that would help potentially with getting those deals, as opposed to someone who maybe have a better service and be not American and not having paid and supported Donald Trump's campaign or the Republicans. So, for example, if you were a company that had donated money to the Democrats and not to the Republicans, maybe to Kamala Harris and not to Donald Trump, then you may be frozen out. So you can see how this can be used. I'm just saying cronyism in that sense, but it could also be corruption. And now that in this document it says 50-50, you have, I guess, control by both parties to a certain extent. However, they could just make agreements to divvy it up and favor people through cronyism or just outright corruption and bribes. So this would be a big risk. There is a clause in the agreement saying that the Ukraine's EU accession process must be respected. I'm paraphrasing. But there is a clause to that effect in it. So Ukraine is on the path to EU accession in spite of this war, the Russo-Ukrainian war, and the biggest war in Europe since World War II. So there will be a lot of benchmarks and harmonization of laws that Ukraine will be required to fulfill in order to move along that process towards eventually joining the European Union. So this agreement will have to respect that. That is an interesting article to have in there, because that could be used, for example, it would give the European Union potentially some influence in how this agreement, what is to be implemented in the future. They may, anti-corruption, for example, is one big thing that the European Union assists on, at least before countries joined the European Union. And if this kind of agreement was very blatantly open to large-scale corruption or, as I said, cronyism, that might be an issue and give the EU maybe a little bit of leverage on how to control how the funds from this are dispersed. So overall, the types of deposits that are stated are minerals, hydrocarbons, oil, natural gas, and other extractable materials. So it does include the rare earths, but potentially with other extractable materials. But that is not actually the purpose of this agreement, draft agreement. We will see tomorrow whether it will be actually signed or not, or whether it will be changed. Maybe this draft is not going to be the final document that is signed. In any case, overall, it bodes well in light of the last 2 weeks of diplomatic shenanigans between and insults, barbs between Volodymyr Zelensky and Donald Trump, if they could actually sign any sort of agreement. And this one would potentially, if there is an explicit security guarantee, then even better for Ukraine. Even without an explicit security guarantee, it would push things in that direction. However, it's not, because it's so vague and we don't know exactly what Donald Trump is going to negotiate with Vladimir Putin. There's also speculation about Russia and the US signing resource extraction deals as well. So it's very, very ambiguous at the moment whether this will turn out to be good for Ukraine or bad for Ukraine. Probably from the US's point of view, there isn't really any downside in this document that I can see, in the sense that, well, basically Ukrainian resources that they would work on extracting would go towards the reconstruction of Ukraine, and the US would have a big say in how those monies are actually going to be handed out on the contracts. So I think overall it is a good development so far, and it probably on the balance of probabilities lead to a better outcome for both Ukraine and the US, but that is not certain, and we'll have to see how things develop. And if you are interested in investing in Ukraine in the future, then this is probably very good news that the US is going to be involved, especially if you're a US contractor, because going forward there will be a lot of business, especially if there are actually trillions of dollars of resources below the surface in Ukraine that the US and Ukraine jointly can actually extract. The other big question, just before I finish up this video, is there's a clause saying that basically Russia, it would seem, and maybe other countries that helped Russia would not be able to benefit from the investment fund. It doesn't explicitly mention Russia, but it talks about countries that have worked against Ukraine. Basically, it is phrased in a way that would lead me to believe that it is talking about Russia. And let's see if I can find it quickly. Yeah, that would seem to exclude any potential way for Russia to benefit from the fund, but at the same time, it doesn't deal with the situation where Russia actually controls a lot of Ukrainian territory illegally at the moment, where the resources are located. A lot of them are located in the Donbas region, which is not entirely occupied by Russia, but a lot of it is at the moment, and also Crimea. That is left unspecified. Of course, if Ukraine is able to liberate all that territory, bring it back under its de facto control as well as de jure rights, then that would mean that this type of agreement would be even more lucrative for both Ukraine and the US. Anyways, drop your comments down below. And things are moving very fast, so I may have to make an update video maybe even tomorrow. And as we say, written on my t-shirt, emblazoned, Slava Ukraini, do peremоги.